They thought they were untouchable, just three loudmouth drunks on a summer trip, egging each other on in front of the Queen's Guard like it was some kind of game, laughing, mocking, daring him to move. The crowd watched, and sure, phones were out, security stayed frozen, nobody did a thing. And then through that tense silence a small voice cut through like a blade, 11 years old, barely tall enough to see over the rail. But what he said turned those grown men to stone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. That child was Prince George. And before one of the men could even raise a hand in his direction, the guard finally moved and centuries of silence cracked like thunder. But hold that moment. We'll get there first. If you're enjoying stories that make history feel alive, again, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss one. And drop a comment below, tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's rewind and set the stage. It was one of those mornings in London that felt like walking through an old painting, sky crisp and blue, air buzzing with anticipation. The palace stood proud against the light, its stone glowing in the sun like it had something to prove. Tourists clung to the gates like ivy, guidebooks flapping in one hand, phones in the other, chasing their little piece of royalty. But just beyond the crowd, tucked behind a velvet rope where few eyes wandered, stood a boy who didn't need a tour guide. Prince George, blazer pressed so perfectly it looked ironed by angels. Hands behind his back, posture straight but not stiff, he looked more like a young man than a child. This was no school field trip. This was a test, a quiet one. No parents nearby, no whispered reminders, just him, a sharp-eyed bodyguard by his side, and the quiet buzz of duty unfolding. George didn't speak, didn't need to, he just observed. Not the kind of distracted glancing most kids do. He watched like it was his job, because one day, it would be. Boots began to echo in the distance, 24 perfect steps marching in harmony. Red coats flashing, tall hats catching glimmers of sun. The band's music rose over the courtyard like a tide, carrying with it centuries of history, all perfectly choreographed. Phones snapped, whispers spread, shoulders bumped. Tourists did what tourists do, but George wasn't looking at the fanfare. His eyes had locked onto something else. A lone guard different from the rest, not in uniform, but in presence. There was a tension about him. Still, yes, like a statue, but alive in a way others weren't. That was Elliot Marsh. The prince didn't know his name yet, but he felt, if this man wasn't just performing, he was watching. Before he wore red wool and stood outside palaces, Elliot wore desert camo in dusty places where shadows held danger. Afghanistan had shaped his stillness, not for show, for survival. You learned how to read a crowd, scan the edges, feel the ripple of something not quite right. And today, something wasn't right. Three men had elbowed their way to the front. Big, loud, drunk by noon. One wore a football jersey that looked like it hadn't seen soap in years. Another had a cider bottle still half full. The third was live streaming the whole mess to whoever was unlucky enough to follow him online. They didn't look curious. They looked like men who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. The biggest one, with greasy tattoos and a bandaged hand, pointed at Elliot like he was a prop. "Look at this one," he sneered, loud enough to make people turn. "Doesn't even blink. You think he's human, or do they wind him up backstage?" Laughter. Not the funny kind. The kind that makes your stomach twist. Elliot heard every word. He always did. But he didn't move. That was the rule. You don't react. You don't engage. You stand like stone, and let their nonsense crumble against your silence. Most people got bored, eventually, but these three weren't most people. The second guy tried to poke fun, waving a chip in Elliot's face like he was feeding ducks. "Oi, robot, want a snack, or are you solar-powered?" Still nothing. Not a flinch. Not even a breath to fast. Nearby, a mother gripped her daughter's hand a little tighter. The girl looked up and whispered, "Mommy, why are they being mean to the soldier?" The mother didn't answer, just stepped back. She wasn't alone. The air shifted. You could feel it. People started inching away, sensing the edge of something sharp and dangerous. Laughter from the three men kept growing, louder, crueler. George noticed the change before most adults did. His eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened just slightly. The way his father sometimes did before press conferences. He wasn't scared. He was watching, cataloging what happened when tradition met disrespect. "Sir," murmured the bodyguard at his side, but George didn't reply. He was too focused. And what he'd do next would remind everyone there that royal blood doesn't always wait for orders. It wasn't the beer can that made the crowd gasp. It was the way it spun through the air fast. Careless sand clanged at the soldier's feet, sending a splash of warm lager onto his polished trousers. Foam hissed across the stones, darkening the age-worn cracks that had seen centuries of ceremony. Elliot didn't flinch, not an inch, not a blink, but inside, every nerve in his body sparked to life. This wasn't teasing anymore. This was provocation. And not the kind you laugh off. The drunk smirked. "Can't even dodge a can. What kind of soldier are you?" His voice echoed across the courtyard, sharp and slurred, feeding on the silence of a crowd too stunned to intervene. Tourists who'd arrived for pageantry now stood frozen, and sure if they were watching tradition or something unravel. Elliot's grip stayed steady on his rifle, but in his mind, maps unfolded routes of approach, angles of defense, variables shifting second by second. He wasn't in uniform now. He was back in combat zones, reading danger from body language instead of bullets. And this danger wasn't done. One of the men pulled out his phone and shoved it in Elliot's face. "Smile for the internet, mate. Let's see if you're human or just built like one." Elliot stayed locked in place. Then the third man, the one who looked like he'd lost more fights than he'd won, grinned and reached into his coat. Again, this time, it wasn't a can. It was a bottle, plastic, filled with something yellow and foul that sloshed thick against the sides. "Bet this gets a reaction," he said. Parents began backing away, shielding their children. A nervous tension coiled tight in the air, buzzing louder than the brass band that had suddenly gone soft, its melody trailing like a dying breeze. That's when George stepped forward, not rushed, not panicked, just calm, deliberate, and shaken. 11 years old, walking straight into the storm like he was taking his place at a press podium. His blazer didn't flutter, his hands didn't tremble. He walked past the velvet rope and stood just close enough to be heard. No microphone, no shouting, just presence. The drunk with the bottle noticed him first. "Well, look who's wandered out." "Another tourist. What are you, some prep school VIP?" The others turned confused. This wasn't part of their script. George didn't flinch. His voice was level, not loud, just steady. The kind of voice you didn't expect from a child. "You're not brave," he said. The man blinked. "What did you say?" "You're not brave," George repeated. "You're 3 grown men picking on someone who can't fight back. That's not courage. That's cowardice." The bottle in the man's hand lowered just a little. Nobody in the crowd moved. Nobody breathed. The leader took a step forward, ready to bark something nasty, but George wasn't finished. "That man," he said, gesturing to Elliot without turning his eyes away from the drunk, "is trained to protect people like you, even when you don't deserve it. He stands there because it's his duty, not because he's weak." The one with the cider tried to laugh it off. "Just a bit of fun, lad. No harm, right?" George turned to him, gaze sharpened. "Throwing things at someone who can't defend himself isn't fun. It's assault. You're not entertaining anyone. You're embarrassing yourselves." The words hit like a slap. The 3 men looked at each other, suddenly unsteady. The crowd wasn't cheering. The phones weren't for laughs anymore. They were for evidence. The man with the bottle stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You think you're better than us, little rich boy?" George didn't blink. "I think anyone who treats another person with respect is better than the way you're acting right now." That broke him. The man lunged toward the rope, grabbing it with one hand, swinging a foot over like he was stepping into a fight he didn't understand. "Let's see how tough you are when..." He didn't finish the sentence, because the second his boot touched the ceremonial stone, everything changed. 2 things happened at once. The prince's protection officer moved fast and firm, hand on his weapon, stepping toward George like a shield unfolding, and across the square, a figure in red exploded from formation like a bullet from a barrel. Elliot Marsh moved not with pomp and pageantry, but like a man who'd spent years responding to threats before they had time to become headlines. In one clean motion, he cleared the rope. Rifle raised, not aimed, just braced, just enough To stop Hearts cold, he slammed into the man with the bottle like a freight train. Controlled force, no rage, just precision. The drunk hit the cobblestones hard. The wind punched clean from his chest. The bottle flew loose, cracked open on the stone, and sprayed its putrid contents in a yellow arc across the historic courtyard. The crowd jumped back. Phones dropped. Gasping echoed louder than the band. The second man rushed forward, swinging the cider bottle toward Elliot's head. He never got close. Elliot's hand caught his wrist mid-swing, turned it with surgical speed, twisted down, and slammed a knee into the man's gut with just enough power to drop him but not break him. The bottle fell. The man folded like a paper bag. The third man took a half step back, but by then, security had arrived in forced black suits and earpieces flooding the edges, guns drawn but not raised, hands moving with quiet expertise. The performance was over, and the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was respect. George hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had, posture straight, eyes steady. Like he understood deep in his bones that leadership doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks with dignity and lets the world listen. And listen they did. The third man never even made contact. He lunged, maybe hoping surprise would work where arrogance had failed, but Elliot Marsh wasn't built for surprises. He'd survived ambushes with real consequences, far from the safe stones of Buckingham. So when the attacker rushed him from behind, Elliot pivoted, stepped aside, and guided the man's own momentum into the pavement. Hard, face down, breath gone, ego shattered. From the moment the first boot crossed the rope to the last body thudding against stone, it had taken less than 15 seconds, a blur of motion, then silence, the kind that rings. Sirens screamed through the outer gates. Dozens of protection officers swarmed the square in dark uniforms and efficient steps. But the fight, if you could call it that, was already over. 3 men lay groaning on the ground, none of them quite able to stand, and suddenly looking very small against the backdrop of palace history. They didn't seem like threats anymore, just consequences. George stood a few feet behind his protection officer now. His breathing was shallow, but steady. His jacket was wrinkled, one button gone where someone had grabbed at him, but his expression hadn't cracked. Eyes clear, mind turning, not frightened, just processing. Elliot remained standing, rifle lowered but ready, face unreadable beneath his tall hat. Like a storm that had just passed but hadn't fully left the sky, the head of ceremonial security approached quickly, flanked by guards whose faces said this wasn't their first bad day but they'd hoped it might be their last. "Guardsman Marsh," the officer called out. "Report." Elliot didn't look away from the downed men. His voice, firm and level, carried across the square like a drumbeat. "They assaulted His Royal Highness." Time froze. Even the men on the ground stopped groaning. The big one, the one who'd thrown the can and nearly the bottle, turned toward George. Confusion slowly dawning. "Wait, him? He looks like." Someone in the crowd filled in the blank. "He is the prince's son." Cameras, once raised for viral content, lowered slowly in reverence. This wasn't a tourist spectacle anymore. This was history, and the crowd knew it. George stepped forward, brushing away the protective hand on his shoulder. He straightened his jacket, small hands adjusting the fabric with the kind of quiet dignity that didn't need applause. Then he walked toward Elliot. The boy looked up at the man who protected him, not with ceremony, but with purpose. "Thank you," he said. Simple, honest. Elliot didn't bow, didn't speak, but something in his posture softened, just for a second. A blink of shared understanding. That was enough. The aftermath unfolded with military precision. Sirens stopped. Armed officers held the perimeter. Paramedics checked the 3 attackers, confirming bruises and humiliation, nothing that wouldn't heal, nothing they hadn't asked for. Statements were collected, evidence bagged, and still, the crowd remained silent. No one begged for autographs. No one cheered. Phones stayed lowered. Like everyone suddenly realized they'd just witnessed something sacred. The leader of the trio, now seated against a barricade with one eye swelling shut, shook his head slowly as an officer approached. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "Thought he was just a kid." The officer said nothing, wrote down his words, because ignorance doesn't undo assault, and some lessons are paid for in shame. George remained beside his bodyguard, watching the square return to order. He knew his parents would want answers, his father, details, his mother, reassurance. But for now, he simply watched how things were set right again, watched how order reclaimed chaos. The guard reassembled at the far end of the square. The band began to play again, softer, more tentative, but the rhythm returned, and the familiar patterns of ceremony marched on. That was the point. After all, tradition continues, even when trouble tries to interrupt. As the three attackers were led away in cuffs, George glanced one more time at Elliot. No salute. No fanfare. Just a mutual, silent nod. A prince and a soldier, forever linked by 15 seconds of unexpected clarity. Later, inquiries would be filed, press statements crafted, lessons debated in royal offices. But none of that would change what had happened out there when a boy stood up to hate, and a man chose the right moment to break the rules that weren't made for real danger. People left the square slowly. An older veteran straightened his back and wiped his eyes. A young mother told her daughter, "That's what courage looks like." A few college students, once eager for Instagram clips, simply pocketed their phones and watched the guard finish their duty. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't found in guidebooks. They're written in real time, by people who don't ask to be heroes, but show up anyway. Back inside the palace, George waited in his study. When the doors opened and his parents walked in, he didn't rush. He didn't explain. He just stood tall and looked them both in the eye. His father came first. Didn't ask permission, Prince William said, crouching to meet him at eye level. George nodded. "No, sir." Why, no one else was helping him. William was silent, studying his son's face for any cracks, pride, guilt, fear. But all he found was calm, measured conviction, like someone who already understood that leadership wasn't about title, but choice. Catherine crossed the room quietly and knelt beside her son, wrapping him in a hug, brief but fierce. A hug that said everything without a word. When she pulled back, her hands stayed on his shoulders. "You meant every word you said out there," she whispered. "I did." His father rose and turned toward the windows, where the courtyard could still be seen in the distance. Marching, music, ceremony restored. "Do you understand what could have happened?" he asked. Still facing outward, George didn't hesitate. "Yes, but I understood what was happening if I didn't." It started like any other crisp morning in the city, the kind of day where tourists sip their coffee just a little slower and locals tuck their scarves a little tighter. But inside the heavy stone walls of Lancaster Hall, something very inordinary was brewing, something that would quietly ripple through generations. Elliot Marsh stood straight as a flagpole, still dressed in his full ceremonial uniform, his tall fur hat resting under one arm. He looked like the kind of man stories get written about because he was. And that morning, he wasn't just being looked at. He was being watched, evaluated. "Wade, you broke protocol," his superior said flatly. "Yes, sir." "You left your post." "Yes, sir." "You used force on civilians." "Yes, sir." There was no stammering, no justifying, no plea, just the truth. And it hung in there like steam off morning pavement. Elliot didn't blink. He didn't squirm. He was a soldier who knew the cost of doing the right thing didn't come with coupons or applause. Sometimes, it came with a pink slip, but something unexpected happened. The colonel leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes narrowing, not in disapproval but curiosity. "Any regrets?" he asked. Elliot's answer was crisp as the crease in his trousers. "None, sir. Not when someone lays a hand on that boy. My job is to protect the family, and I'd do it again." The colonel nodded, slow, thoughtful. He tapped a file on his desk. Elliot's record had more than just dates and assignments. It had commendations from combat zones, notes from psychologists about calm under fire, and handwritten phrases like "a soldier's soldier." "You're being reassigned," the colonel finally said. Elliot's jaw didn't twitch, but there was a flicker in his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Where to?" The colonel cracked what might have been a smile. "Close protection. Personal detail. The family specifically asked for you." Now that made Elliot blink. Turns out, one young royal had spoken up, not just at the gates that day, but behind closed doors afterward. He hadn't asked for punishment, he'd asked for loyalty to be honored. And that loyalty wasn't lost on the crowds either. By the next morning, the usual buzz around Lancaster Hall had changed. Sure, the tourists still lined up to see the Guards march, but the tone was different, a little quieter, a little more respectful, like people knew they were watching something more than costumes and polished boots. Among the crowd stood a young boy, maybe 10 or 11, school uniform neatly tucked in, eyes wide with curiosity. His teacher had used the incident as a real-life lesson in class that morning about standing up when it's easier to sit down, about speaking when silence feels safer. "Why'd that man help the soldier?" one kid had asked. The teacher had smiled gently and said, "Because sometimes the brave thing isn't loud or flashy. Sometimes it's just refusing to look away." And there they were, watching history unfold not from a textbook, but from behind a simple rope line. Elliot marched with his unit, head high, movements precise. Reassigned, yes, but still very much part of the fabric he swore to protect. As he passed, the schoolboy gave a small salute, not the wild kind kids do when they're playing soldier, but one filled with quiet respect. Elliot didn't return it fully. That would have broken formation, but his eyes flicked ever so slightly. A private nod, a soldier's way of saying, "I see you too, kid." Behind the secured section, young Prince George stood watching. But this time, the lines in his face told a different story. Less boy, more man, less confusion, more conviction. He had seen the cost of doing what was right, not in speeches or lessons, but in one guard's quiet sacrifice and in the storm that followed. And in that understanding, something inside him shifted. He saw that leadership wasn't just about crown and ceremony. It was about stepping forward when everyone else stepped back. And sometimes, it was about lifting someone else up, just high enough that the world couldn't look away. And so, the tourists left that day with more than just photos and souvenirs. They carried a story, a moment, a whisper of courage tucked between snapshots and fridge magnets, not because it was flashy, but because it was real. A reminder that dignity is never outdated, and that doing the right thing no matter the cost still echoes louder than any command. Sometimes it meant speaking when others stayed silent, and sometimes it meant being willing to accept the consequences of doing what you believed was right, regardless of what those consequences might be. As the ceremony unfolded with its usual precision and pageantry, tourists watched with enhanced appreciation for what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a performance or tourist attraction. It was a living demonstration of values that still mattered: duty, honor, the willingness to protect others even at personal cost. Children who might have fidgeted through previous ceremonies stood quietly, sensing importance in what they were seeing. Parents found themselves explaining concepts like service and sacrifice that they hadn't planned to discuss on a family vacation. The guards themselves seemed to stand a little straighter, march with slightly more precision. They'd been reminded that their ceremonial duties connected to something larger than routine. They represented ideals that people were willing to defend when those ideals were threatened. Near the end of the ceremony, as the final notes of the regimental march echoed across the square, something unprecedented happened. The crowd, several hundred strong, began to applaud. Not the scattered and sure clapping that sometimes followed tourist events, but sustained respectful applause that acknowledged what they'd just witnessed and what it represented. The guards didn't acknowledge the applause directly. Protocol didn't allow for that, but something in their bearing suggested they'd heard it and understood what it meant. Later, in the quiet moments after the crowd had dispersed and the square had returned to its normal rhythms, one truth remained clear in the minds of everyone who'd been present. Strength wasn't about size or aggression or the ability to intimidate others. Real strength was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous, even when you were just 11 years old. And facing down three men who should have known better, Prince George had shown that kind of strength when he stepped forward to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. Guardsman Marsh had shown it when he broke protocol to protect both the prince and the principles they both served. And in doing so, they'd reminded everyone present that ceremony and tradition weren't empty pageantry. They were the visible expression of values that still mattered, still commanded respect, and still deserved protection when they came under attack. What would you have done if you'd seen three grown men harassing a guardsman who couldn't respond? Would you have found the courage to speak up like Prince George did? Have you ever seen someone defend others when no one else would step forward? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story showed you something about what real courage looks like, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable people who uphold these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who needs to hear about the kind of strength that speaks quietly but acts decisively, share this story with them. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real courage doesn't announce itself with noise and bluster. It simply steps forward when stepping forward is what's needed.